I cannot tell you what an absolute honor it is to be able to join you at this international gathering today. It's an especial pleasure for me because I know that brothers and sisters are watching from across Europe and even from my own homeland of Hungary. My mum and I moved to the UK when I was around 6, maybe 7 years old, so while I sound rather British, please don't let my accent mislead you. When we moved to the UK, we mainly lived in, rural areas, idyllic kind of Lord of the Rings, Middle-earth areas in the Midlands. But since then, I've spent the majority of my time living, loving, working in cities. I lived in Birmingham for about 13 years before I moved to London about 3 years ago. And so, I'm a newbie to London, but it's such a joy to be with you. And what a city London is, isn't it? Isn't it a great, great city? I often just kind of step back and just think, wow, I cannot believe that I am here. I cannot believe that I get to kind of teach at a Bible college in North London. I can't believe that I get to walk along Oxford Street. You get to see the Christmas lights. It's just such a magical and beautiful city to live in. May I share with you just some of my own changing story of life in this city? Until I thought about this the other day, I hadn't realized how much I found my own welfare in the welfare of the city, a la Jeremiah 29. This city really was the gateway to my ongoing ability to remain in the UK. I remember first coming to London in order to renew my visa at the Hungarian embassy. Well, I remember my mum and dad trying to do that. I just remember standing in endless queues, looking out of windows, sitting in photo booths, and just cannot wait for it all to be over, really. So much paperwork. There was also just as much paperwork on those trips to London when my dad decided to adopt me. And so in a very real sense, London has granted me a home and a family. On those trips, I remember feeding the pigeons. Don't do that, say no. And I remember climbing up to sit on the lions, guarding Buckingham Palace. I'm sorry I don't have any pictures. I was going to bring them with me. I could go on. There is so much to say about this city. And, needless to say, my family, whenever they were visiting from Hungary and Romania, the first place they'd want to go was London. My cousins were overwhelmed by it, most probably due to my very poor sense of direction. I am and I remain a rubbish tour guide, but I can tell you this. Did you know this? Do you know why all the railings in London are painted black? No. Well, it's because upon the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria commanded them all to be painted black. They used to be red before that. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, I know, right? So today we can still see these kind of the fingerprints of great lives, like Queen Victoria's, upon this great city. And it's upon very small lives like my own, and upon much larger lives like your own, which this city leaves its fingerprints. Whichever city you're joining us from today, I'm sure you'll be able to tell similar stories of your own cities, both how your life has been blessed by the welfare of the city and how you've blessed the city. Most of our cities, though, are hubs of architecture and innovation, of culture and of finance, have just stood empty during the pandemic, particularly the peak of the pandemic. Since the first lockdown last March, we've lived through a devastating 14-month period in the UK. Cities tell their own stories of life during COVID, don't they? And cities across the world have been the most impacted by the pandemic. The urban poor bearing the greatest weight. In fact, the socio-economic impact on London is projected to be greater than Paris and New York City. From wherever you're joining us today, while I hope you've experienced better, my hunch is that you've probably experienced the same, if not much, much worse. Who of us hasn't been affected by social isolation? The helps and hindrances of technology, headaches, sleeplessness, just that dislocated sense of sadness, uncertainty, fatigue, just to name a few of the experiences on the milder end of the spectrum. And when that is stretched out to over 9 million people in this city, and then stretched out again to about 750 million people in Europe, and then stretched out again to 8 billion people in the whole world, we can't even begin to fathom or imagine the impact of the pandemic on each and every life and on each and every city. This year has seen a rise in crime, abuse, and poverty, to name just 3. London is a city in which homes aren't always safe places. In the 3 years leading up to the pandemic, there was a reported 63% increase in domestic abuse. It doesn't even seem possible, but during the pandemic, that figure rose again by 12%. This is a city in which streets aren't always safe places either. According to a House of Commons briefing paper published in October, London recorded the highest rate of knife crime in the country in 2019 to 2020, with 179 offences involving a knife per 100,000 people. 100 people were killed in the capital last year. And it's also a city in which 2.5 million people live in poverty. It's a city in which not everyone is able to eat. London is a city in which its own police officers kidnap and kill. And yet, rather than fear or uncertainty, another emotion is said to mark 2021. I wonder if you can guess what it is. Adam Grant, a New York Times journalist, earlier in May, brought to our attention someone's attempt to discern the dominant emotion of 2021 in the West. And it is languishing. Can you relate with that? It's a feeling of stagnation, of emptiness. The term was coined by a sociologist named Corey Keyes, who was struck that many people who weren't depressed also weren't thriving. It's the often overlooked middle child between depression and human flourishing. Stagnation and emptiness. How apt is it? It might not only sum up some of our own emotional states, but also the condition of the lives in the cities. Well, the life of this city anyway. Stagnant, empty, languishing. I wonder if it's how you feel as we look back on all that's happened and as we look ahead to all that's to come. Just a little bit meh. It's a great English word, isn't it? Having experienced the vibrancy of life in our cities before the pandemic, are they now just doomed to languish in its wake? And more concerningly, is that the set trajectory for the mission of the church in the city in 2021 and beyond? No. No, it's really not, is it? It's not at all. And I'd love to encourage you as to why not. We got to celebrate Pentecost last Sunday, didn't we? And at Pentecost, one of the many wonderful things which occurred is Peter telling the house of Israel that the promise of salvation is for you and for your children and for all who are far off, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself. Our Lord is alive, isn't he? He's at work throughout the pandemic and beyond, and he continues to call those who are far off close to himself. He loves to do that just as much today as he did at Pentecost. It's often when it looks as though that nothing is happening, as it may have done this past year, that Jesus is doing his most powerful work through his Spirit in the life of the church and indeed the world. We can't celebrate Pentecost from the cross, can we? Let's briefly just lurch back to the events that took place prior to the outpouring of our Father and his Son's Spirit. It was the blackest, darkest day. Jesus hangs on the cross, and with him, so too do the hopes of his followers. The earth quakes as the true rock before them seems to break before them, and yet they have absolutely no idea of what is being silently undone on that Holy Saturday, nor what or who they would receive later in that upper room. We do not know what is being silently undone, especially on days, maybe even years, when everything speaks to the contrary. And what a year we've had of precisely that. And yet the promise of salvation stands as much today as it ever has done. God is calling all who are far off to himself. Isn't that just spectacular? The Lord is calling the far off to himself. The promises upon which we stand, he extends to London, to Paris, to New York, to Budapest, to Barcelona, to Berlin. It's to people in these cities he longs to make himself known, and so many others. And he longs to make himself known to the faces of our cities. To one of those faces belongs the name Kelly. Again, I wish that, well, actually, no, I shouldn't have brought a picture, data protection. To one of these faces belongs the name Kelly. Names have also been changed. Kelly is a makeup artist on Regent Street, and she works for the cosmetic company Bobbi Brown. I like to think of her as my makeup artist, but I know I have to share. I got to see Kelly the other day, and she just told me all about her life during the pandemic. She was furloughed for the majority of the past year or so. Half of her colleagues have lost their jobs in London, and while she's really grateful to be back at work, she finds the contrast between empty kind of spaces in London to the hustle, bustle of the underground as it was on Saturday, just so deeply unsettling. It's just as unsettling as the question of the long-term viability of her job. You know, the company was once going through growth and expansion, but now due to the pandemic, it's shrinking, it's downsizing. She's cheerful, she smiles, but there's a sea of sadness in her eyes. She's lost loved ones, and who knows what's around the corner for her and for them. And yet the promise is for all who are far off, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself. Another name is Alicia, I should say. Her aunt, close friend of her mum's, opened up this incredible crepe fan just outside Brunswick Park in Enfield. And she's 16, and her GCSEs were severely affected by the pandemic. She's able to carry on for her A-levels. She hopes to go to Manchester to study English Lit and drama. Her mum, professional photographer and caterer, decided to open up this crepe van along with her best friend. And as she was cooking this delicious kind of crepe, she told me all about the story of the business. Her mum has always wanted to move away from photography, and her dream was to do exactly this, to set up a little business. And the pandemic for her, whilst really hard, actually gave her the time to dream the dream and to make it happen. So Alicia said that business is thriving. They're doing so much better than they ever hoped. The promise is for all who are far off, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself. And finally, just one more picture. There's Serena. Now, Serena is my hairdresser. This tells you a lot about my life, crepes, makeup, hair. But Serena has been my hairdresser for about the past 3 years, loyal like that. And she has such a cool job. She gets to walk into the lives of just so many people. She has exclusive clients in Hadley Wood and Southgate. She's a few years older than me. She lives at home with her mum, her sister, brother around Enfield. Again, she was furloughed for a long time. They lost close relatives. And now she's just exhausted. She uncovered malpractice in her former workplace, was dismissed as a result, and is now setting up her own business. Each time I see her, I get to hear about the twists and turns of her story. She's doing something now again that she never would have dreamt of, and she would never be doing had she not been furloughed. The promise is for all who are far off, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself. Kelly, Alicia, Serena, these are just 3 of the 9.3 million people living in the metropolitan area of London. This is just a small snapshot of the lives of these 3 people. There are so many different people, aren't there? There are different people, different lives, different stories. And I wonder what the lives of the people around you look like. What are their hopes and their fears? Far from languishing, this is a moment of opportunity, especially for you as leaders and as church planters. This is our moment. This is our time to love the city. The Lord is calling those who are far off to himself. As leaders and planters, you get to help people like me love people like Kelly, Alicia, and Serena. You get to help us to move into those hurting spaces of poverty, homelessness, domestic abuse. You get to help us to rejoice and support their fledgling businesses, celebrate with them in their joys, and you get to help us to comfort them, grieve with them, and most importantly, to hold out the word of life to them. The Lord has placed and called each one of you in this room and live streaming to where you are meant to be today. Your godly leadership is vital for the life of the church, her mission, and its place in this city. The World Economic Forum picks up on good governance as the main marker of success for cities emerging from the pandemic. Again, sorry I don't have this up. They state that cities which have emerged stronger after a crisis are those that have demonstrated good governance, were ready to embrace change and were agile, innovative, and creative in their response, provided social safety nets, boosted service delivery, created community trust, and encouraged community involvement. Good governance has emerged as one of the key drivers of successful responses from cities. The World Economic Forum recognizes and lists these biblical principles for flourishing: good governance, agility, innovation, creativity, community trust, community involvement. They are recognizing what God has always seen and designed into the natural order of creation. So what an opportunity this is for you as leaders to love the city. The task may feel great, but what an amazing relief to be reminded that as we look out on what's to come, might come, won't come, it's God alone who calls the far off to himself. We all get to partner with him as he makes that call. This is a really exciting time for mission in cities. Perhaps never before have residents of local communities been so rooted in the life of their communities, or so open to more than they are now. I wonder if the Lord might be up to something here. With so many furloughed, unemployed, relocated to the countryside, or continuing to work remotely, I wonder if this might mark a shift away from the regular, centralized, large-scale evangelistic events to an emphasis on an every-member missionary mindset. Mission has moved from the city centres to the boroughs, to the quartiers, to the localities. As one friend put it, he used to feel like a Birmingham person, but suddenly, due to the legal restrictions put on movement, he no longer felt like a Birmingham person or even a Selly Oak person, which was his part of Birmingham, but a Shenley person, that was his part of Selly Oak. He started to notice his little bit of earth much more than he used to. And another friend said the same. She says that she's been seeing neighbours and people by the postbox, at the takeaway on a Saturday night, on the bench outside Costa, or every day in the park, much more than ever before. And so how do we love the city well? Who are you primarily aiming to reach? Is it the people around the church building, or is it the people who live around the church members? If the building is in close proximity to its members, that's wonderful, but that's not usually the case in all cities, especially in London and especially now. This might be a time for outreach through home groups embedded in their communities. This might be a time to shift away from experts in evangelism to discipleship and freedom to fail as brothers and sisters, just give it a go. This might be a time to re-emphasize the importance of workplace ministries. And as particular parachurch apologetics ministries have crumbled, this might well be a reminder from the Lord of the need for homegrown, local initiatives in the context of committed relationships of growing disciples to make disciples. Church planting has always been significantly important, but the opportunity some of you have or will have is cosmic, especially now. People have never been as open so much to the gospel as they are now. In the wake of new atheism, the loss and longing for transcendence, comfort, community, relationship, and hope, perhaps these might be some of the roads along which the Lord calls the far off home. I wonder if this actually might be a time of revival across Europe. And each one of us listening and in this room gets to play a part in that with the living God as he builds his church. For the promise is for all who are far off, everyone whom the Lord our God calls to himself. 40 days after the devastation of the cross came the explosion of Pentecost. What might happen in the 40 days or weeks after the pandemic? There's a question to leave you with.